Good evening, everybody. I'm glad to be here. I was glad to be invited to come and speak. I know some of you from the OAS training program, and I have been glad to be part of the OAS community since I moved up to Oregon from California a couple of years ago. As you know from the introduction, I am an Egyptologist who has been fortunate to have excavated in Egypt and Greece as well as California, and to work. Okay. How about that? That's good. Okay. All right. So I've worked with some different teams in Egypt and Greece, done some work in California and San Clemente as part of the Channel Islands. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is materials and research that I've done on the tomb of Tutankhamun. My connection to the tomb of Tutankhamun began in my first field season in Egypt when I visited the tomb along with other royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. My appreciation of Alfred Lucas also began in the early time of my graduate studies because he was the author of a foundational book, Ancient Egyptian Materials and Technologies, which is a must for any archaeologist who's going to work in Egypt. During my graduate studies, as I focused on objects, a corpus of material I wanted to study, I do love objects. I gravitate towards objects as not only something to hold, but I love the stories that go along with objects and how much studying a single object, if you look through it expansively, you can learn so much about the time period, so much about the social circle of the person. So I'm quite fond of objects. And in my graduate studies, I decided to study the ancient Egyptian scribal palette, which is the main tool of the Egyptian scribe, as a corpus of material to see how it changed over time, as a grave good, as an object that was put in graves, what inscriptions it had on it, what level of person in society had it in their graves. And in the course of that study, ended up studying the 15 scribal and painting palettes that are in the tomb of Tutankhamun. So I kept coming back to the tomb at different periods in time. I wanted to start a little differently tonight before we go into the tomb and talk about what it means to study objects. And so I have my friend here. This is a replica of the very iconic mask of Tutankhamun. And it's hard to find a good replica because one of the things that a lot of replicas leave off is that there is text along the back. And looking at an object as something that has 3 dimensions makes you think about it differently than seeing a picture. So the object has a lot of space because it wasn't just a mask. It actually sat over the shoulders in the front and in the back. And you may have seen this many times, but the materials that it's made out of, everyone knows gold, but all of the blue stripes were glass that were molded onto the gold frame. The necklaces underneath, all of them had different glass and precious stones that were part inlaid. There's inlay on the top. There's inlay everywhere. And they did very interesting things with glass where they would put pigment under a section of glass to enhance the color even more. Or might have translucent glass and would paint a picture on the back of it to have it pop out more. So I want you to think about, because we're going to talk about Lucas as a conservator. He was not an archaeologist. He was an analytical chemist. And how does a conservator think differently about objects than an archaeologist? And I've talked to different conservators at different times, and they often say, oh, we care what it's made out of. Well, archaeologists do too. A conservator is not just looking for how to get it out of the ground safely, but what they can do to keep it alive and healthy for 50 years, 100 years. What are they going to do to it to make it stable? Because structural stability is something that's important. How it's made is something that's important. What are they going to do that won't harm it and leaves room for technology to suggest new things so that things can change? So that's my spiel for think like a conservator, not like an archaeologist right now. So I chose this particular picture from the tomb of Tutankhamun. Alfred Lucas is not in the picture. Howard Carter, who found the tomb, Arthur Callender, who was someone he worked with quite closely. And then you can just see on the lower right-hand side, there's an Egyptian worker. A lot of the photos that were taken that were kind of the show photos would have an Egyptian worker here or there, but they did not get identified in the record. But I wanted to acknowledge that he was there. So I don't know who he was, but he's there. And what's happening in this scene is they're wrapping and packing up statue 22, one of the guardian statues, for transport. Lucas isn't in the picture because a lot of the work that he did was not visible to the camera. And where he did his work wasn't actually in the tomb. He had a laboratory set up in another tomb, kind of nearby. I'll show you how close in a minute. But a lot of the work he did was more behind the scenes. He was an analytical chemist who had worked in Egypt for more than 20 years at the time that this particular excavation started. He was known to archaeologists, but he didn't really work with them. He worked for the Egyptian government. He did different things with land surveys and water things for the Egyptian government. But he was a scientist first and foremost, but he was also an optimist. He was a problem solver. And so I like this quote from him because it talks about his approach to, even if something looked totally destroyed, he always thought there was something that could be salvaged. This is a perfect perspective to have as a conservator. This is the situation. I want to kind of lay the groundwork. This is what it was like in 1923 and also in 1922. So the tomb of Tutankhamun was surrounded constantly by a ring of tourists looking to see what was being brought up out of the tomb. And you can just see people, so the tomb is down below. We'll get into the tomb in a bit. And then it was carried from the tomb off to KV 15, which is the other tomb where the laboratory was. Cleaned, preserved, stabilized for transport. But when I say stabilized for transport, think 1922 stabilizing for transport. The crates had to be carried for about 6 miles. There was one of those railways where you keep picking up the track and putting it in front that was for part of it. And so it had to be really, really stabilized to make it to Cairo, because then it went by boat. So this is what Lucas had to work with. So think about for a second what you expect to see in a laboratory. This is what he had. The tomb of Seti II, which was somewhat nearby, had an opening in the cliff. It was about 12 feet wide and twice as long as that, about 24 feet long. That was their laboratory, open to the elements and within a tomb. He had these little tables. He had all of his liquids and conserving things. That this is how he worked. And so this is a photo from Illustrated London News. The media covered the excavation partly because Howard Carter had made deals with the media to get more money to help continue the dig. Now, Lucas, in addition to working on the materials, he was someone who already had published a lot. And so he wrote articles also for the New York Times and telling people about what the process of conservation was. He thought it was very important for people to understand the complexity, the chemistry. He never dumbed things down for the audience. because he thought people should understand, why is it taking so long to take these things out of the tomb? It's because we're being careful, because we're being appropriate. He had a book that was a register of samples. Some things he was able to sample on site. Other things he had to send out to have analyzed in different labs. Luxor area at this point in time didn't have a lot. It didn't have a lot of supplies. He had to bring everything from Cairo. So he kept track of every single sample that he took from objects to send them off to be analyzed. And I want to give you an idea of what I mean when I say it was a nearby tomb. So KV 62, that's Tutankhamun's tomb. Way over here is KV 15. That's where the laboratory is. And then right across from Tutankhamun's tomb is where Burton had his photo kind of studio. Now, it isn't really that far, and I put in the scale partly because you should always have a scale with a map. And secondly, because I love the fact that the Theban Mapping Project put in meters, but they also put in the ancient Egyptian measure of cubit. So you could see how many cubits it was compared to meters. I just think that's a lovely nod to the architects of ancient Egypt. So let me take you now into the tomb and kind of get you oriented to the different rooms. And some of you know a lot about this already. Some of you have probably been to the tomb. Some of you have probably seen exhibitions around the world that had the objects. But this is the entrance that comes down this set of stairs, and there's kind of a sloping passageway. And then there are 4 major rooms. The antechamber, we'll take some look at pictures in a minute. I've colored this yellow and blue just so you can see them a little more clearly. The antechamber was the first room that they cleared, and the burial chamber was not the first season. Lucas worked with Howard Carter all 9 seasons. It took 9 years to clear the tomb. And then the treasury was right off the burial chamber, and the annex was the last thing to be excavated or cleared. All right. When you come down that passageway and you look to the right, that's what you would see, or that's what they saw. So the discolored area here, that is the bricked up wall that when they take it down will lead to the burial chamber. And you've got these 2 guardian statues here, and then boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff. That's looking to the right. On the other side, looking to the left, this is what you would see. So the chariots, a few more of the couches, again, piles and piles of boxes. And as I'll show you in a second, they knew going in that this was a mostly intact tomb, but that there had been tomb robberies in the past. And very much in the past, very much of the time of Tutankhamun, maybe within a decade at the longest. There'd been at least 1 group of robbers, possibly 2, because they went for different things. And so that confused the archaeological record to some extent, because what had happened, the robbers had gone in, they'd disarray, threw everything everywhere, carried what they could out. And then the necropolis administration found out, came in, hurriedly tidied things up by stuffing things back in boxes to make it look tidy, and often damaging objects in the process. And then they resealed the door. And that's how they know that there were at least 2 other entrances, because of the change of the ceilings on the doors. So you're looking towards the back part here. This is one of the robbers' entrances into the annex room. And this is the mess they made in the annex. They threw things every which way. And all of these these vessels that had cosmetics, and cosmetics I mean like cold cream and oils and things like that were perishable and very expensive. They must have had wineskins to put them in. And a couple of these even have at the bottom, you can see where the tomb robber was scooping it out with their hands. This is the marks of their fingers left behind. So let's come back to this right-hand side, looking towards the burial chamber, because we're going to start. I'm going to show you a couple of different boxes. We're going to look at a couple of larger objects and take you through step by step how Lucas worked through the difficulties and the problems. And to begin with, the team had to figure out how they were going to keep track of all these objects. I think the final count that I've seen is about 5,400 objects were in the tomb. They knew that there were thousands, and they wanted to keep track as they went along. So they did these placards. They put a number by each object. Burton, who was the photographer, he would take a picture of the area without the numbers and then a picture with the numbers. And then for each number, they had note cards where they would make notes, put dimensions, and have different people add information. Sometimes it was just a couple of cards, sometimes it was a dozen cards. They just kept writing on to the next card. And Lucas, with all of his conservation treatments, his notes were always on the last card, and I'll show you what some of his notes look like. So this is the beginning of the work of numbering and documenting. And then again, I just want to take you through the tomb in a slightly different look. So this is at the bottom is the staircase entrance. The passageway is where they found some of the things that tomb robbers had dropped along the way. And then they get to the antechamber. So they started numbering. The first object was actually 004. The second doorway was 13. And then they kind of went around the antechamber kind of counterclockwise till they got to this doorway into the annex. So the first 171 numbers, there's more objects than that. And I'll show you in a minute how that worked. But the numbers, like a box would have a number, and then inside of it, it would be A, B, C, D, E within the box. The antechamber was their goal for the first season, and that is all they did. So they did not go in, they did not take down the wall to the burial chamber. This on the left is Lucas's handwritten notes that were kind of more extensive. And the Griffith Institute had scanned all of his notes and all of Howard Carter's note cards. So this is his more extensive thoughts on the left for that very first box, casket 21. And then you see the heavier writing at the bottom of the note card. Lucas always wrote in a slightly darker pen or with more pressure or whatever, because his notes are very visible there. And these are the notes of what he said, the treatment of the box summarized. Cleaned with soft brush and benzene, filled up small cracks and blisters with paraffin wax dissolved in benzene by means of a pipette, sprayed with a solution of celluloid in amyl acetate, and finally coated the box inside and outside with melted paraffin wax. This was to preserve, but they also found out when they moved the box from the tomb to KV-15, the laboratory, humidity was different. And the joints started to expand and the paint started to lift off. And it was a beautifully painted box. It was like, oh no. So he took he knew he was going to use wax for a lot of different things. It was very common and it was very neutral. So with a pipette, he put little tiny bubbles of melted wax underneath each piece of lifted paint and used it as an adhesive to keep it down until he could spray the external. So this is kind of a summary of the different problems that he noticed and what the treatments he came up with, whether he used a soft brush, whether he used cotton wool, whether he used benzene, amyl acetate. In his notes, he often gives percentages of solutions. So conservators today can know exactly what he was doing with all the objects. Why paraffin wax? And Lucas, at the end of 2 years of working in Tutankhamun's tomb, he wrote a book on treatment of antiquities. And he talked a lot about paraffin wax and pointed out that what you really want to know is what its melting point is, because, especially in Egypt. So you have to look for a paraffin wax that's going to meet your requirements. Paraffin wax was widely used at this point in Egyptian archaeology. Metropolitan Museum, people waxed coffins all the time as a way to protect them. So this is the Metropolitan Museum workshop in 1936. And there's a fascinating little silent video from 1924 on their website that shows them applying the wax, heating. On the top, you see the Bunsen burner, and then ironing out the wax a little bit with a buffer in between and applying the wax. So let's come back to casket 21. It's this box here. You see how much painted material there is on it, the painted scenes. Inside the box, I mentioned that within the box number is 21, and within there's a running list of what they came across. So 21A is its sandal, 21B is its pair, 21C was a headdress, ceremonial robe. Each item got its own number. This is just the first 26 items. There were, I think, 54 in this box. And what they said when they did the publication about the box, if we had searched the whole tomb through, we should have been hard put to find a single object that presented a greater number of problems. It took 3 weeks to get to the bottom of the box. And you'll see why in a minute, because the layers, they went layer by layer, and they were learning as they went and learning what can we touch without it falling apart? What do we have to be careful of? And so this was kind of their test case, and it really did present as many problems as you could imagine. So this is the first layer when they open the box. Some kind of garment with beading on it and some sandals. So on the note card, they noticed right away, and this was true for a lot of the beaded material, the beads were there, they were still in the pattern, but the threads holding the beads onto the fabric had disintegrated. So this couldn't be touched without it falling apart. So they worked to record as much as possible to get the details, and then while they were kind of trying to come up with some other things. So on this note card that's just on the left-hand side, that's the pattern of green and green, and then the sequins in between, because there were gold sequins. So this is like kind of the first attempt to capture the pattern. These are notes, and Arthur Mace gets credit. He was from the Metropolitan Museum. He worked with Lucas on a lot of things. He was very meticulous. He loved doing this type of pattern and counting and everything. So these are his notes for what the patterns looked like. And this is his calculation of the size of the garment based on the pendant strings, how much distance between them, what the pendant strings would have been along the hem. So he worked out how many sequins in a pattern, 9 square centimeters. He worked out that the size of the garment would have been 80 by 50 centimeters. So good sized garment. Before they actually moved it, they poured hot wax where they could to try to preserve some of the groupings of beads. Lucas's treatment was what to do with exposed portion of the garments, Canada balsam and xylene applied with a pipette, melted paraffin wax. They were experimenting with different things. And this is also a solution of celluloid dissolved with amyl acetate and acetone. This is all they came up with. That's all they could salvage from that robe. But at least they salvaged something. And it told them ahead of time how much textiles were going to be a problem. Some textiles survived well, others did not. This is the second layer. We're still in casket 21. We've just hit layer 2. So there are sandals, there's some sort of garment with gold sequins, there's some other stuff in between. The force with which the boxes were reloaded by whoever did the tidying up forced some of these sandals to puncture ones underneath because they were stuffing things in. Out of this batch, he was able, so this garment, you can see that the textile survived much better. It's actually a child's garment. There were a number of child-sized things within Tutankhamun's tomb. He came to the throne at the age of 9 or 10, and there's even coronation regalia that is child-sized. There's a little throne that's child-sized. And there are things kind of from his childhood there too. So, and this is a child-sized garment. Again, these are the notes that were taken about this particular sandal. I just chose one of them to show a little bit of the pattern, to show how the sandal was constructed with the different components. And here, again, in the darker ink, this is Lucas's notes. Treatment: to remains of sides and heels, applied solution of Canada balsam in xylol by means of a pipette. What he doesn't say here, but he says in his longer personal notes, is that the rawhide bottoms of the sandals disintegrated into gooey messes. The treated leather did okay, but the other stuff ran over some of the other objects, and it was just a mess to try to clean. And I'll show you in the next slide. We're going to see how this leopard head, you can see a little bit of the dark patch there. That's sandal that had disintegrated on top of it. Now we finally are at the third layer. And look at how different the materials are. We've got a necklace, we've got some other types of materials. We've got something with sequins on it that are star-shaped. And this leopard head, this is where it's damaged from the leather. You can't tell on this because this is black and white, but these are glass inlays here. And this is all he could manage to save of the garment. But you see the little talons here? Those were silver. So what's the significance of a cloak with a leopard head? In funerary ceremonies in ancient Egypt, and I'll show you a scene from the Tutankhamun tomb. The figure on the right, you see that he's wearing a leopard skin cloak, and you see the head of the leopard there. Can you see that okay? This was a very important part of the rite of the ritual of opening of the mouth so that the deceased could live again. And it's usually done by the heir of the person who died. What's interesting in Tutankhamen's tomb, because he did not have a designated heir, I was actually a general in the army who took over the country after Tutankhamen's death. And he's depicting himself as an heir in the tomb, which is very unusual because he was like grandfather age to Tutankhamun. All right, now we're going to go to another box, other side of the room. So you can see on the right-hand side that one of the guardian statues, we've kind of turned the corner, and this box number 54, the number is underneath the box. The number that's on top, that 53, relates to a bunch of materials that were on top of the box. But this box is box 54. Very different looking box. No painted material on the outside, no scenes, but it's ebony frame, red painted wood, quite striking looking. And again, I've just given you a list of the first 26 items in the box. And there's a lot more vases and things like that. But let's take a look. Let's pop open the top of the box and see what it looks like. I didn't even show the first layer because it's just disintegrated cloth. It has no distinguishing anything. The second layer, you can kind of see the folds of a robe and a scarab, which at first they thought was part of the robe, but they found out later was a separate thing. You can see on the bottom there are some open holes. You know, those are vessels that you're looking down on them. And I want you to pay attention to two things. On the right-hand side, do you see this shape that looks like a little snake? Oops, didn't mean to go to the snake. So the snake wanted to come up, so we're going to go right to the snake. But that didn't belong in a box like this because it wasn't an ornament. It had brackets on the back. It should have been attached to some sort of furniture. So they knew it was something that had been on the floor scooped up by the priests who were cleaning things up and thrown in the box, but they didn't know what it belonged to when they first found it. It was beautiful. It was bronze. It had gold highlights on it. They did a sketch and thought, okay, we'll figure out where it went later. And you'll get to see later where it goes. The next layer down, there's all this massive stuff that turned out to be all these little tiny tiles of gold and glass and other things, some sort of, at first glance, some sort of corselet, maybe some sort of necklace. They didn't know till they got everything out. But the tomb robbers must have argued about who got this, because it was torn apart and bits of it were found all in different places in the antechamber and then kind of stuffed in here. When it was finally taken out, this is what it looked like when they finally put it back together. Now we're going to go on to one of the larger objects. So showed you a couple things about boxes and smaller objects in it. Now we're going to go back to the two guardian statues. This one on the right is statue 22. What do you do with a statue like that? How do you figure out what to do for its conservation? It's not delicate in the same way, or it could be, but it wasn't. But it was covered with resin, and then there was also gold. And so cleaning it, you didn't want to clean it and have the resin run onto the gold and then have to clean it off the gold. So cleaning it became another complicated thing. And again, with the pipette, they had to put bits of it under paint that was kind of lifting, or resin treatment that was lifting. And here, so Lucas is the one seated. Arthur Mace is the one standing up. This is in their laboratory. This shows you how wide it was, just room to put the statue in there. And then to kind of work bit by bit to make sure everything that was lifting up was secured with wax. This is Lucas's treatment. Gold, cleaned with warm water and ammonia. Black, cleaned with water sprayed with acetone. Totally different elements, so they couldn't run into each other. Repairs, loose stopping, near shoulder, refastened with glue. Strengthening, blisters and hollows in gesso were filled with paraffin wax. Loose eyebrow refastened with cellulose cement. So as a good conservator, he told you what he did and what he did it with. And then it had to be packed to go over to the boat, up to Cairo. And Carter had bought in Cairo yards and yards and yards of material to pack things with. And this is them packing up, and they kind of had some wooden stretchers. They would put things in and then wrap all of these things around it to secure it for the journey. We're going to come back now to the antechamber. The chariots were to the left. I'm only going to talk about chariots very briefly, but the chariots that were in there had to be taken apart to fit in the tomb because the tomb passageway was too narrow. So everything was dismantled at the time the tomb was filled. And then all the things that were leather had melted over. So extricating and figuring out which things went with which chariot, that took a while. This is chariot 120 when they finally got it reconstructed. And where they are now, remember I told you the tomb, this is KV 15. There was this entranceway, but part of the reason they chose it, it had this big courtyard in front of it that they could work on larger objects. So there they are cleaning and doing minor repairs. The chariots themselves were not in bad shape. And here's where our snake comes in. So here on the left, it's a little harder to see. If you see that snake, it fit on, there was a snake on each side of the interior of the chariot. They think it might have had a functional reason because it's in chariot 122. Chariot 120 had some gold bars in the same place, so maybe it had a functional reason. What you can't tell well from here, there's the snake, and if you can kind of see there's a black semicircle beneath it. The ancient Egyptian word for eternity is jet. The snake is the j sound. The T is the T. So this says eternity in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs in 3D on the chariot. Let me take you back into the tomb. We're going to go to a different chamber now. So the treasury room, which is on the other side of the burial chamber. At first glance, the Anubis shrine does not look like a box, but it is. It's a container. And I'll show you the inside of it in a minute. But it was a portable shrine. You see the poles in the front? It was meant to be carried in a funeral procession. And this is a scene from a tomb scene. You can see them carrying the Anubis shrine. Would have taken at least 4 men. If it was heavier, the one in Tutankhamen's tomb probably had 4 men on each side, each pole area. This is about the same time period of Tutankhamun. So it was carried during the procession. There's some evidence that sometimes canopic materials or canopic chest was inside. The canopic chest in Tutankhamun's tomb was too big to have been carried here. But it's possible, just one potential theory that I have, that the canopic contents were carried in it. I'll show you why in a minute. So this whole lid that has the Anubis on it slides off. And this is the inside. And this mostly contains broken jewelry. There are some little cups of things that Alfred Lucas analyzed that had natron, which is an embalming component. And there are 4 compartments here, could have held the viscera that then go into the canopic chest. It might have been used for something else like that before, and then for Tutankhamun's tomb, it was its final use, was maybe with gold stuff put on the outside. I don't know. But it is in its own way a box. In the treasury room, we're just going to look very briefly at a couple of other boxes. You see how all this stuff is like fringe and things coming out of the boxes? Because this area too was hit by the tomb robbers and cleaned up by the same people who were not that careful about how they jammed things into boxes. And I'm just going to show you briefly in box 271 and box 272. So 271, these are some of my scribal palettes that I studied from the tomb. And what's most interesting about the ones here, Tutankhamun, when he came to the throne, he followed Akhenaten, Aten being the state god at the time. When Tutankhamun came to the throne, his name was Tutankhaten. And then later he became Tutankhamun. And there's a scribal palette for each of his royal names. And I think that's very interesting. Okay, we're going to go into box 272. A fan. This ostrich feathers. This fan with all the nubs. So these ostrich feathers were eaten by insects, but this was in the burial chamber. And it shows on it an ostrich hunt happening. And then, but imagine this with the same semicircle of ostrich feathers that you would have here. This was just a handheld one. And it was almost all, there was some dried fruit. That was all that was left in this box. Everything else that was in it had been taken. Back to just to orient you again. So we've gone to the treasury. We've gone to the antechamber. We're going to zip over to the annex, which we know tomb robbers were in. And then we know this is the mess. And yet, even with all of this, a tunic that is in much better shape than what was in the antechamber was survived. This is linen. And more of scribal palettes that were gifts, gilded wood, gilded ends. There was one that was a slab of glass, inlay of different kinds. So the annex brought a lot of things to light, even though it was the most damaged area. We're going to go quickly to the burial chamber. Sorry to leave the mummy to last, but we're not going to spend a lot of time there. The biggest problem in terms of conservation was that the mummy, when they got to the final coffin, see all this black? These are libation liquids that were poured over the mummy at the time of burial, and they had hardened. And they didn't respond well to different solvents. And they had a screening coming up with major dignitaries coming. And the reason that they show him still in a coffin for that examination, they couldn't get it out. They had to chip it away and use solvents and then add heat to the sides. They dragged it out into the sun and tried to heat it that way. They put zinc plates and did, heat along the side to finally get it out. That, of course, also meant that the mask had some of those problems. So when it comes to the mask and we have this nice little clean whatever at the end, and I show you this mostly because the mask often, you didn't get to see the back of it. If something had an inscription, the note cards, it all had to be done by hand. There was no typing font that you could use like you can now for hieroglyphs. So everything had to be transcribed by hand on these little note cards. And then when it was handwritten, and then when it was transcribed by the Griffith Institute, they just put little ellipses to show that there was an inscription there. So you have to go back and read the original handwritten. Actually, there was a German scholar, a couple of German scholars who put together all the corpus of all the hieroglyphic inscriptions. I'm going to recommend, if you want to see more about glass from the Tomb of Tutankhamun, this is a 7-minute video from the Corning Museum of Glass. You can see it has more images than it has some information, but it's really to show you the beauty and the complexity of the glass. And if you just search Corning Museum of Glass Tutankhamun, you'll find the link, but I put it on here. And then I'll leave with this, headed to the end here, this quote from Alfred Lucas, which I think speaks to his appreciation for the object. And how much, when he looked at an object, one of his questions was, what do you need from me? What do you want me to do to keep you healthy? I want to mention the colloquium that was that sparked, my interest in Alfred Lucas at a deeper level. And I bring it up because I think it's so important that conferences ask people different questions. With the discovery of Tutankhamun hitting the 100-year mark, there were a lot of things of, okay, what wonderful things were found? What are the contents? What is all that? This colloquium asked, what's the impact? What changed? How did archaeological techniques change? How did relationship with media change? How did our perception of Tutmania, Tutankhamun as a celebrity, how did everything change? And I liked that idea. And so that's why I decided to do a paper, and I decided on Lucas. And so this was the call for papers, the colloquium in 2022. Colloquium was in 2023. Rogerio Sousa was determined that we would get published final book at the end of it. And this to me felt very much like what Lucas believed in publishing and sharing knowledge. That was his whole career was spent on that. And I did bring, if people want to see the book, I brought a copy so you can see the different types of things people gave papers on. Shout out to Griffith Institute, their online access to Burton photos, Carter cards. I could not have done my original paper, any of the research I've done for this. I couldn't have done it without them scanning, transcribing, and making available to the public all of this material. Again, this importance of sharing the information so that people can continue to do research. Acknowledgements and thanks to OAS and to Dave Root for inviting me. Acknowledgements to Griffith Institute and to the University of Lisbon and Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, which did that colloquium, and Rogerio Sousa, who was so encouraging and supported as I explored different things with Lucas. And then a final, this is me at Mitrahina, one of the places I excavated. If you have questions, if you want to know what to read, if you are interested in knowing something more and I can point you a direction, I'm happy to do that. I've been wanting to do some teaching in a different sort of way for a while. And so starting next month, I have a cat named Merlin. He is going to have an Instagram account. And he is going to teach people ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic words from a cat perspective, very cat-centric. First word being cat, so ancient Egyptian was a phonetic language. And what it spells out, and I'm not kidding you, is meow. Doesn't work for all Egyptian words, but it does for cat. So he and I are gonna do an Instagram account, and I'm gonna have a website where I can have some small lessons for people who want to learn just a little bit more, bite-sized pieces. So if you want to be on my mailing list, send me something to my email. If you have questions about what should I read about if I want to know something about Tutankhamun, then please do contact me. Thank you very much for your attention.
The language lessons, do you think it'll be appropriate for younger children?
It's going to be pretty simple. So it's going to be the hieroglyphic word, and then he's going to show you some context of where you might find that and how it gets sounded out. And the posts that are the words, they're just going to be that, maybe with a couple of images of so Merlin's idea is cat-centric means we start with cat, we go to mouse, and then bird and fish, things that are important to a cat. So there are tomb scenes that then show a cat catching a bird, catching and eating a fish under a chair. So there'll be some tomb scenes that I can then illustrate the cat doing things. And so one set of posts, the Monday posts, I think are gonna be like the word of the day, but just once a week. And the Friday posts are gonna point you to like a cat statuette in a particular museum, or a cat scene in a particular museum. So you can go explore the different museums out there that have Egyptian materials. But yes, so a younger child could do something with that, because that's going to be very short. This is what it is, and this is what you can do with it.
Cindy, I just had a question when you said gold might be kind of soft.
So they would take like a sheet of gold, hammer it out, and then sometimes they would cut it with a die type of thing. And then sometimes they were concave and they would shape them around something. So sometimes alloy with copper or something else to make it pliable but a little sturdier. Okay, so the ancient Egyptian scribes, they kept administrative records, and they inscribed on practically every surface you could find. So an ancient Egyptian scribe, instead of having like a pen case we would have today where you might have a pen and ink that you could put in, it was like a length of wood that had a slot in it to put reed pens. They used reeds. They would chew the end of it to make it almost like a brush. And then it had red and black pigment in around at the top. They used red and black in ancient Egyptian writing from the very beginning. Black was the main color, and red, you think of it kind of like a highlight or a bold. So sometimes they would write certain words in red. Sometimes they would, in religious texts, they would write certain gods' names. It changed. Black was what they always used, and then red was their second color. So they would dip the brush in a little bit of water. They had a water pot, and then they would rub it almost like a watercolor on the red or the black, and then they would write with it. Yes.
Yeah, so Alfred Lucas was good at sharing information. Did he ever share mistakes that he made or his colleagues made?
Yes, in his notes in particular, sometimes he'll say, okay, treated it with this, would have been better to do this other thing. He was very precise about language, and so he also corrected other people's mistakes. But he was open to the fact that he might have treated something wrong. And actually, even with the waxing, he knew that it was hard to remove wax. He decided it was the best option at the time. for protection, for long-term protection. When the New Egyptian Museum, the Grand Gallery, when they moved the Tutankhamun coffins over there, they removed all of the wax very painstakingly, and they've used a different solution on the top of it now to protect. The main problem with the wax was it collected dust, and that dulled over time. But as what it was meant to be, to protect it, it did accomplish that.
Am I right in understanding that was the burial chamber ever broken into, or was it just the other three?
The burial chamber was broken into, but not the burial shrines. So the burial chamber, the shrines, there was very little room around the sides of it. So the tomb robbers broke into it, scooted along the sides of the shrines to get into the treasury. But it was even complicated in 1922. They had to do all kinds of engineering stuff to lift the sarcophagus lid, to get the shrines apart. Everything was built in the tomb, very close quarters. So there's no way the tomb robbers could have gotten through the sarcophagus and all the coffins. So they did not get to the body, the mummy, but they did get to the objects around the edges of it. Mostly they wanted to get into the treasury. I really do think it was an inside job. I think they knew what they were looking for. But not only did they go in and look at the treasury, but the excavators at the beginning, they confess in their notes that they they knew they weren't going to get to the treasury for a long time, but they went and peeked.
So I believe they had at movie here, they had the Tutankhamun thing, and when I went, I was amazed at the boxes within the boxes within the boxes. So that was all constructed within the tomb?
At the shrines, yes. They brought in the components, and then they built it in the tomb with very little space to spare. Added protection, but it was an Egyptian thing to do, to have a box within a box within a box. Each layer meant something a little bit different. Probably within the first decade after Tutankhamun's death, just based on the types of seals. There isn't another royal name in the sealings, but the sealings of the necropolis officials, it seems to match with probably it happened within the first 10 years. The reason they sometimes say two groups of robbers is it looks like one target was all of the oils and creams, and the other target was metals. But they had to be able to carry it out that very small opening, so they couldn't take large things. But a lot of the jewelry in the treasury was probably taken because they could, get that out past those shrines, kind of going sideways, but probably within the first decade. And then the entrance to the tomb ended up being covered by the land being the excavation of a nearby tomb. They put all the debris on top of where the tomb entrance was. That's why it wasn't found for so long.
I'm
Okay.
gonna check online to see if there's questions from the Zoom.
Okay. And if you think of something later, just send me an email.
Are there any records that provide a clue as to when the grave robbing and then the cleaning out took place?
Yeah. Not records. There are some ancient Egyptian papyri that deal with other tomb robberies, but not this one.
Did Lucas then do all the preservation and artifacts after they got back to his real life?
He actually cared for the Tutankhamun materials for years and years afterwards. He went to the Cairo Museum. He continued to consult with Carter. Lucas was on the train when they moved the golden coffin. When they did the first exhibit in Cairo, Lucas consulted with Carter about that. And he took care of during World War II, he helped move things around so that because they were afraid of bombing, he maintained contact with the materials for years and years afterwards.
They went to the Cairo Museum. Was this the first time that they really weren't like actually taking these artifacts back to Britain?
So the laws, this 1922 was during the rise of Egyptian nationalism, and they had just changed all of the rules and laws around that. Before that, there was the partage system where people got a certain percentage if, but that changed just before the Tutankhamun find. And that's why it didn't leave the country. Okay, thank you all again. And like I said, if you have questions, let me know.
Very good. Very interesting.
So how do I end?
Like your lecture, it was very good. Very
Yeah.
informative.
Thank you.
I got in trouble with that image. I was in Cairo Museum. I took a picture and it flashed. And I had all the guards descend on me at one time. And I'd been going through, but I was really excited to see it. So I
Right.
forgot to put it off, to
Right.
turn off the flash. I
Right.
thought they're going to take my film and roll it all over and stuff. They said, no, your finger over flash. Very nice to me. But it was with that.
Yeah.
It was the face.
Yes. So how